2024 webinar series with the Policy Professionals Community of Practice. And it's now in our 5th year, which is a terrific milestone to celebrate. And as host of the meeting today, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are on and recognise this land as Aboriginal land. I'm here on Gadigal land, and I know there will be many other lands across wherever you are joining us from as well. So I'd like to start by introducing our speaker today, Ruth Owen, who leads the Strategic Implementation Group in the Premier's Department. And this includes the delivery of public sector reform, cross-sector mobility, the internal IT, finance teams servicing the Premier's Department, the Cabinet Office and the Ministry. And Ruth has over 30 years experience leading large-scale operations and reform in the UK and in the Australian Public Service. And in the UK, she led operations of delivery departments such as employment, tax and welfare, and she was also appointed the operational delivery head of profession across the UK public service. So hopefully we'll get some insights from that role. In moving to Australia, Ruth joined EY Advisory as the lead partner in human services, and most recently she has been Deputy Secretary at Education, where she led the COVID task force, learning improvement, and in the last year was appointed Chief Operating Officer, driving transformation in the services delivered by the department to New South Wales public schools. So that's also amazing experience for you to draw from and share your learnings today. So Ruth has a presentation that we will run through, and with lots of time for questions. So we'll get started with that presentation. Hi Ruth, how are you?
Hello, good morning everybody. Great to see you all. Thank you so much for the opportunity to chat with you today. Just acknowledge I too am on Gadigal land and want to pay my respects to their elders past, present and those emerging leaders we work and walk alongside in our community. And thanks for the opportunity to share a little bit about what I'm doing now. So I've literally only got 3 slides, so this isn't PowerPoint, death by PowerPoint, but I want to talk to you about the reform that I'm leading across the New South Wales public sector. I want to put that in position of helping you understand the roles of the Premier's Department and the Cabinet Office. If you're still from the changes last year, just trying to work out who does what, happy to guide you on that. And then we'll go into a wider conversation. Really keen to hear what are the kind of issues you'd like to raise around reforming our sector. It is our sector. We are stewards of this system, so really keen to hear from you, and happy to take any questions about what I've been doing here in Premier's Department in Education, or if I can drain my memory of what I did in UK government too. As you can hear, a wide breadth and depth of experience in government, and I'm keen to share my experience, but keen to learn from you guys too. So that's the plan for today. So let me jump into the few slides that I've got and just share with you what I'm up to currently. So if somebody can just flick on to the second slide. Do that in a minute. But the first thing I just wanted to put into context, you guys may know this, and you may know this really, really well, but there might be 1 or 2 people out there still not sure how DPC split into the Cabinet Office and the Premier's Department. And as policy colleagues, I think it's really important for you to understand how we operate and what we do respectively and when we come together. And I think the first point I would like to make is, although the 2 departments did separate for good reason, and I'll go into that in terms of what the Premier wants from his central agencies, we do work really, really closely together. So the central agencies across TCO, Cabinet Office, Premier's Department and with Treasury too are really conscious of the role that we play in guiding line agencies and departments and collaborating with you. So wherever possible, we try to be joined up and give a single service, but important for you to know our respective responsibilities and accountabilities. So in a nutshell, the way I remember it is, if it's about a policy matter, particularly a policy that's in development, which is a lot of the things that this community of practice will be focused on, generally you'll start your connections with the Cabinet Office. You can see their strap line there on the slide, leading policy, strategy, integrity from the heart of government. So the Cabinet Office colleagues will particularly be working alongside you where you're thinking about bringing policy through your department into Cabinet. The Cabinet Office does have a specific role, specifically required by the Premier, to give independent advice to Cabinet. So you'll be familiar, I'm sure, with the kind of the blues that go up to Cabinet that are separate from the policy advice and papers that you put up, and an important part of how the Westminster system works, which I will come back to. You will also be familiar with the fact that all our Cabinet practice and support to Cabinet comes out of the Cabinet Office. Then in Premier's department, if you think about the kind of end-to-end policy to deliver each aim, we're the next step along the way. So we generally deal with you once your policy has been confirmed, and our strap line is connecting to deliver from the heart of government, and that connecting piece is about working alongside you, collaborating with you and making sure we understand how your policies are meeting the needs of government, meeting the needs of community, and are engaging at that kind of horizontal level across the sector, because we know the wicked problems that we're all trying to solve never get solved in silos. They all have to interconnect. So that's part of the role that we perform in the Premier's department, is making sure we see the connections across whole of government, big issues, big commitments and big deliverables. And therefore we are providing service to government on assuring them that the commitments and the priorities that they've got happen in practice. They're working alongside you on that basis. Anything that's whole of government tends to come from or be led through the Premier's department, and we have a role particularly on focusing on assurance on those really top level government commitments and election priorities. So I hope that helps as I talk through what role I'm playing, and as you think about your role both within your individual department, your individual team, policy responsibilities. But I think an important function, I'm really pleased to see how mature this community of practice is for policy practitioners in particular, because your engagement with the central agencies and as vice versa, it's really got to be enmeshed and a sense of mutual respect and understanding of the roles that we each play. So happy to come back to that when we go into conversations and questions, but let me move on now to tell you about the specific reform that I am leading. If somebody can press on to the next slide. So the origin of this work that I'm leading, which is reform across the whole of the public sector of New South Wales, was, as you will imagine, post-election 2023. The government comes in and wants to be absolutely assured that the public sector is teed up, structured and focused in a way that they are confident that they can get their agenda delivered. That's absolutely as we would all expect a new government to want to come in and make sure that their public service, their public sector supports their agenda. And you'll recognise that this Minns government, from a Labour point of view, have been out of power for several years and therefore have been away from working with the public service and the public sector for some time. So it is a kind of reconnection between government and the public sector and the public service. And really, the government instigated a review as soon as they came in of what is the governance, what is the structure, what is the capabilities, what's the ways of working, that they can be sure and have confidence that we will deliver their agenda and work again in collaboration with them, again respecting the positions of the executive and then the public sector. You'll hear me talk about both the public sector and public service. I do so deliberately because there'll be some people on this call who don't see themselves covered by the GSE as an example. If everybody can just go on mute, that would help. Thank you. My remit, and obviously the remit of the reform across New South Wales public sector, is every single agency, department, entity that serves the government of the day. So whether you're covered by the GSE Act, whether you're covered by the GSF Act, what I'm about to talk about involves you. So really important that you understand that and that we are engaged together. So what are the things that we are doing? The kind of driving principles are making sure we are match fit for the agenda that this government needs to deliver. That does mean looking back a little bit at some of the changes that we've made to ways of working over the last few years and just checking in on whether they actually meet the requirements of the government of the day. And you'll see on the slide there, the headlines are the sort of the principles that I start with that I will talk about over and over again is, of course, integrity. That's absolutely at the heart of everything that we do in the public service. Having the trust of the community, having the trust of the executive and government is absolutely vital for everything we do. And I know you know that. Alongside integrity, we've got to follow the principles of really sharp and clear accountability, both within government and within the sector. We've got to be really clear on transparency and making sure that's part of building confidence in what we do. And actually, we need to be agile and mobile because, as I said, we recognise that everything government wants to achieve, everything we want to achieve as officials within the sector is about how we best work together. And that, as you well know, can be some of the areas where we stumble, is where we can't get that collaboration, agility and mobility to work effectively. So let me unpack some of the changes that we are leading on and that you might want to engage me in conversation on. First and foremost, we are trying to revitalise the Westminster system of government. Always pleasing for me to hear that coming from Westminster, but you're all familiar, I know, as a community of practice about what that means. And unpacking that a little bit, I'll go into some of the changes that that will bring about. But for example, the government did announce fairly on in their tenure that clusters was not a thing that they particularly supported in the ways of working across our sector. You'll know clusters are not a legal entity. I'm sure you know that, but they've become a way of working, a way of simplifying complexity across the New South Wales public sector, which meant that you had a department with lots of agencies serving multiple ministerial portfolios within a cluster. And although they weren't a legal entity, they did end up causing some degree of confusion of accountability and sometimes weakened cabinet government, because some decisions, the clusters got so big, some decisions never actually got as far as cabinet because they were resolved between ministers within a cluster or between secretary and ministers within a cluster. And one of the principles that the Minns government wants to work by is really strong cabinet government. So re-establishing cabinet is where decisions get made. I think we'd all agree that's a good place to be because they were elected representatives. They know the political decisions that they need to take based on great advice from us. So establishing cabinet as the way government decisions gets made and making sure that government and cabinet has full transparency of how the government is and the public sector and public service is discharging the decisions that get made at cabinet is a really important part of this transparency and integrity piece. Of course, we want to recommit to the public service values. I am not implying in any way that we lost connection with them. We absolutely do. Everybody I meet across the sector here in New South Wales believes, passionately believes in those values that underpin every way that we work. But it's an important part of when you think about reform. I didn't want to talk about reform in this part of the sector and have the values on the other side of the ways of working and thinking. They need, again, to be an integral part of the way we think, act and do. And when I say integrity, that's absolutely part of the values of what we bring to the public service and what drives us every day to do good, bring good advice to our elected officials and to have good administration. Bear with me 1 second because my lights have gone out here, so I'm going to do the usual little wave to get my lights back on. And we're back on. Okay, look, probably going to have to do that every few minutes, so bear with me while I do that. You've been in those rooms before. All right, let me press on. As the public sector, we need to be really clear on what the priorities of government today are. As you're well aware, we don't have Premier's priorities anymore. That's a thing of the past. We've moved away from that, and we are looking at refreshing the state outcomes across the sector. But the government has been really clear. For the time being, the things it is really focused on are, and no surprises here, colleagues, absolutely no surprises, housing is right at the top of the agenda for this government for all the reasons that you understand. Energy, climate change, and the shift that we need to make to clean energy. Again, it's a long-term programme for us in New South Wales. The government wants to drive forward on that. Jobs and the economy is obviously a really important part of what we've got to do, including addressing cost of living crisis right now. And then education and health and the kind of essential services that those two important departments deliver, an important part of the commitments that the government made through the election, and actually an important part of the workforce commitments that they made about essential workers and the vitality of what that workforce brings to the community, and the outcomes that we want to deliver across the community. So when I talk about priorities, those are the things that I want to make sure that every public servant across our sector understands how they are supporting, if appropriate, those priorities. Those priorities could well change over time. So that's why we haven't kind of put them up in lights as published priorities for this government, but this is what we are focused on right now. So how do we go about that within the sector? I've got 3 pillars here just to talk you through. What are the things we're doing to make sure that we are fulfilling the Premier's requirement to strengthen Cabinet, to make sure that we have clarity of accountability, and that we tease out those small changes that we need to make to remove clusters as a way of working. So first and foremost, as I started, central agencies is critical for the government to get the advice that they need and that independent advice, and to beef up the way of thinking about policy within government sector. So creation of the Cabinet Office separate from the Premier's department was the first act that was part of this reform to support the Premier and how he wants government to run. And this is both leading and enabling and supporting you in those policy in the policy advice that we give to government. Secondly, we are talking about departments and affiliated agencies. That's the terminology we are choosing to use rather than the confusion of the word clusters. Happy to take your feedback on that. And what we need to do now is make sure that within what used to be clusters, so within those affiliated entities, everybody's got crystal clear understanding of who's accountable for what. That might sound really straightforward, but it is really important when you've got big, complex principal departments that have got entities, some of whom are independent, some of whom are affiliated within the legislation, some of whom has specific employment relationships between, say, the CEO and the secretary, or have an employment relationship, say, between a head of entity and a minister. We just need to reconnect to that Westminster system to be really clear what that means in terms of relationships between a department and its affiliated agencies, both from a policy point of view, from a financial point of view, from a governance point of view. So we are looking at things like the Cabinet Practice Manual, things like the Guide to the New South Wales Public Service, and things like the Minister's Handbook. So between ourselves in the ministers, in the ministry, between ourselves in the public service, and those of you in the wider sector, those of you who are in SOCs or independent agencies, we've got that clarity of accountability and we know how to relate to each other. And then the second thing that's really important in terms of sharper Cabinet government is that whole framework of outcomes and accountability for delivery. And you may well be familiar with the fact that this government is adopting performance and wellbeing framework. We are out as the central agencies between Cabinet Office, Premier and Treasury right now, consulting with you and your colleagues on what that performance and wellbeing framework will look like. That sets out, it's very similar to the model that the Commonwealth has used. So we are stealing with pride some of their ideas and then making it fit for purpose for state government. And within that, we are refreshing the state outcomes, which we are deliberately trying to make agency agnostic, again, to reinforce that point of, if you want to make big change, intergenerational reform, we've got to work together, and there's no agency that can deliver outcomes solely on their own, that we need to collaborate on some of those big outcomes. So if you're not familiar with what we're doing on that, feel free to jump in and ask questions about that later. The second piece we're doing on focusing on those priorities is first and foremost those machinery of government changes. Easy to say, quick to enact, but I know has a kind of long tail and long impact in terms of people, jobs, roles, etc. So creation of the two departments of Cabinet Office and Premier's Department was the first one off the traps. And then in January, we created DECOO and DEFI, splitting out the Department for Planning and Environment, very much because housing and energy, climate change are two really big priorities. So having specific departments focused on those priorities was a request of the government. And thank you to those of you who are in those departments, making that change a reality. The machinery of government is the easy part. Now it's about actually enabling and bringing forward the reform that drives the need for that machinery of government change. And then in February, Homes New South Wales was created in DCJ, again with a separate CEO, but within the actual department, focusing on housing and homelessness in particular. And that, I believe, is going well, but lots more to do to address the root causes of the need for that change. So machinery of government change is one thing. Any department that wasn't part of those machinery of government changes has been asked to undertake a functional review, and we've been doing, my team has been facilitating those reviews. Each of them has got individual terms of reference, depending on the context of your department and what it was particularly focused on, or any changes that your ministers have asked you to make. But fundamentally, it's taking a quick step back, looking at your department under the current government's ways of working, priorities, and making sure that you've pivoted from the past to the present to the future, that you are fit for purpose for what your ministers need you to do. You are 100% focused on their priorities, and that you are shaped in a way that will deliver on their agenda within the budget that you got from last year's ERC decisions in particular, which for some departments made some significant challenges, as well as challenges around things like reducing senior executives, reducing our dependency on consultants and contractors, etc. So taking overall what we know about the government's requirements for your department, each department has undertaken their functional review to make sure they are fit and ready to move forward under that agenda. They've all been done in fairly similar ways. Some have completed, DCJ and Education have completed, whereas others are completing over the next few months. But again, happy to take questions on that. And then final piece under that pillar is outcomes networks. These are being established by the Cabinet Office, and they're another way to drive that sense of joining up across departments, entities on those top priorities. So first one to be established, an outcomes network on, you've guessed it, housing, because of the importance of so many different departments contribute to the outcomes the government wants to achieve in obviously further completions of new housing for people in need of housing across New South Wales. And the Cabinet Office holds the ring on that outcome network, facilitates and enables everybody to understand what's their contribution to that big challenge, and enables Cabinet to have full line of sight of the work that's going on. And obviously can also facilitate things like joint budget submissions for departments needing to get new budgets for that important priority. So new outcomes networks are being established across things like energy, more to come on thinking about the social policy areas of outcomes networks. Finally, then, on the third pillar, about us, really thinking about us as stewards of our own system in the public sector. How do we become collaborative, agile, and transparent? So things that you'll see from our reform agenda here is being really clear what those outcomes are. You will see that as we create that performance and wellbeing framework and engage with you on what are those top level outcomes that we all want to make sure that we are heading at that kind of true north, and make sure that you in your strategic planning, in your budgets, and in your reporting, understand the outcomes that you're driving towards. So as always, there's several layers to this. You've got the really top level kind of well-being outcomes, and then you'll have collaborative outcomes, and then eventually as departments or entities, you'll have your own KPIs, program indicators that you will need to report against. That updates what we've been doing on outcome-based budgeting that you all have been engaged in the past. I think it's a good refresh of that system, and we have, as central agencies, really tried to look at minimising some of the reporting burden that we know caused difficulty for some line agencies under that previous system. So again, happy to talk about that. Professional networks. This is the place to talk about professional networks because you are a great exemplar. Really keen to make sure in that mobility, transparency and collaboration pillar that we are finding ways to connect with each other. And again, clusters gave us one way of doing that in a portfolio, for example. But there are lots of ways within professions. So this is a community of practice. We have a community of practice across our CFOs as an example. I'm speaking with CPOs tomorrow in their community of practice. So what are the communities or networks that we need to make sure we are thinking as much horizontally as we are vertically across the sector? And it's an important one as we remove the essence of clusters, that particularly professionals who aren't in lead departments make sure they are connected in with their community of practice. So if you're a CFO in an independent agency, for example, really important that you understand the changes in budget guidance as much as those who are CFOs in the key lead departments. So we're keen to make sure we understand how these communities or communities of practice or communities or networks are enabling collaboration. And I will listen with intent on how you work as an exemplar for other professions. Really finally then, 3 quick other things. Mobile workforce, we are enabling mobility. You know, the GSE Act enabled us to move people around wherever the sector needed, and that creates great career pathways for all of us. The reality is it is quite hard still to move around this sector. So I have established a team in my group here in the Premier's office, Premier's department, to make sure that we're enabling mobility. Our focus right now is on people who are becoming surplus through some of the change programs that are underway, but it's a great embryo, a proof of concept that once we get that element right, we can scale up and enable mobility as a kind of way of managing talent and career pathways right across the sector. The CPOs are very familiar with what we're doing on mobility. So if you've not heard, check in with your CPO about what we're doing in terms of mobility, but equally happy to share what we're doing and what we're learning from that experience as we go. Budget guidance, really important part of the framework of how we govern the public sector around here. Again, clusters created a great efficient way of working across a small number of departments, but we need to be really clear. We're working very closely with the Treasury on updating budget guidance. Some of it is coming out now that you will see as we lead into the 2024 budget. Some of it will take another year to mature and give you advice on strengthening accountability and transparency within government. So to take as an example, what's the right threshold by which a department and its affiliated entities can transfer government money between different programs, and when is it actually a cabinet or ELC decision to say, actually, we're really clear we want to spend that money on that program, and if that money isn't being spent, we don't actually want officials taking decisions about cross-subsidisation. That should come back to ERC. And then Secretary's Board, a really important part of our governance. The reform that the Premier asked for really beefs up, I think, the role of the Secretary's Board, both in terms of being the stewards of the sectors. They're our senior leaders across all of our departments and entities, and really important role that they play. But again, the amazing strength that we've got when those secretaries come together as the senior stewards of the system and senior advisors to government. So the role of the Secretary's Board has been strengthened at the request of the Premier and the engagement of all secretaries, both to lead the sector, but also to be primary advisors to government. So sometimes things that the government wants to consider, they will say, we want the view of the Secretary's Board on that particular aspect of policy, particularly where it's multifaceted and multifunctional. All right, I feel like I've spoken a lot, so let's flip to the last page and then I'm going to open up for conversation and questions. So these are your takeaways. These are the things, if you don't remember anything else I've said today, these are the things that when you talk to your colleagues, just think about that piece right in the centre. I think this is the thing that we really, really get passionate about. We want to win the trust of our government, of course. We want to win the trust of community, because all those amazing outcomes that we jump out of bed every morning to achieve, we do so on behalf of our community, and we can't achieve that as public servants if we don't have that trust. And you'll be very familiar, I know, with the fact that public trust in government, in public sector, in institutions is not at a great high right now. So across New South Wales, that has to be part of how we win the trust of our community. How do we do that? Through all those pieces, being really clear on our purpose and our priorities, making sure that everybody across the sector is focused on the right priorities, has that clarity of accountability, has that clarity of purpose and priorities ourselves within our own sector, has transparency and integrity running right the way through everything that we talk about, but also recognises we can never succeed on our own. So we need to find the ability to collaborate on those key outcomes and find a way for us to retain the talent, skills and capabilities across the sector that you'll know comes in heaps and spades across this sector. And while we go through change, really, really important we retain that corporate knowledge, corporate capability, experience and passion, actually. So let me finish on passion, because I'm sure you've got lots of questions and issues that you want to raise. So thanks for listening. I hope that was useful in engaging you on the reform. I hope a lot of it was familiar, but if not, chime in and let's open a conversation now.
Great, thank you. And while I'll just give some instructions about the Q&A session. And then I've got a few questions to get us started. So while you're thinking about your questions, yeah, we'll be able to keep the conversation going. If you can put your questions into the chat, that would be great. And then I can hopefully put them in some order so it works well. And don't forget when I've called you forward to turn your camera on if you can, and introduce yourself in terms of your name and your department that you're from as well. Okay, so we might, Ruth, we might just really, well, first of all, I would say I'm really pleased to hear about all of those amazing things, and really observe there's so many different elements to the reform that are interrelated. And it's actually interesting because it's the first time that I've heard about all the different pieces, although I've heard snippets of this and that. That's quite fascinating. You mentioned the role of the professional networks as well, which is also really exciting for us, having really started out as a kind of grassroots policy community of practice. We now have 2,500 members, which is terrific. I still think, given our broad definition of policy and those interested, we've probably still got some growth to go. In terms of recognising policy as one of those areas of professional networks, do you think that is likely to see some interest from the central agencies in supporting?
I'd like to think so. Yes, so if I kind of bring my UK experience to bear here, as you mentioned right at the start, Louisa, I was head of profession for operational delivery, and I had a colleague who was head of profession for the policy, like your kind of community of practice. But we converted it into a proper profession. So we had professional standards, we had professional learning and accreditation, we had clear career pathways that were sponsored, not just by government, but that secretary who was responsible for the policy community. And so speaking as myself in the operational delivery head of profession, I was responsible for creating the professional learning and accreditation. I also did things like talent management, so making sure that I was familiar with the people coming through the profession and that they were supported to build out their career pathways in a way that we could see kind of succession plans coming through. Is that light thing gone again? I'm going to just keep talking, so I think you can still see me.
Yes, you're fine. You haven't turned into a shadow. We can see you clearly. Yeah.
So I think to go back to your question of, it's great, it really is great. And look, see, you've got 300 odd people on this call, that you've got a community of practice where you share your experience, you share learning together. But how can we formalise that more so that you're clear on what your career pathways could be, because that helps with the mobility. We are, as a sector, and alongside the government, clear on what are the capabilities that we need to develop in our policy community. How do we develop the right professional learning? How do you get accredited so you can be proud of the capabilities that you've got in this particular profession? So I think there are things that we can think about, and that goes to some of the thinking that the Public Service Commission is doing right now as another of the central agencies, but an independent agency, on future workforce strategy and what that might mean. So that isn't a decision, but I'm speaking now as Ruth rather than as a member of the Premier's department. That's something that I strongly believe in, is the kind of professionalisation and being clear. How do we support communities of practice to get to that level of maturity?
That sounds great. Just drawing on your UK experience, or what I'm sure it's all there in your in your catalogue of experience that you can draw from, even if it's not always at the front of your mind. But are there any lessons that we can learn from the UK public sector, either in policy or its implementation?
So what I would say first off is we are very, very similar. So the sort of things that we are doing here in terms of developing our capabilities in the public service are mirrored there. And having worked now both in both systems, I know we watch each other quite carefully. So when I was in Westminster, we used to look and see, well, what are the Aussies up to? Because it's always good to see sort of innovation and change and compare yourselves. And then likewise, as you say, it's always important to kind of check in on what other jurisdictions or nations are doing. So I would say the key things that we are doing here, but we need to keep in lockstep with what they're also doing in the UK, is firstly is that professionalisation. I think the UK has led the way there in being really clear that there are roles for generalists and there are roles for specialists in a sector of this size. And how do you then support those professional communities to grow capability? And many of us will recognise, particularly in this community, policy goes in waves. Sometimes it's a real strength and we build that capability. And sometimes we work in eras and contexts in which policy isn't valued quite so much. And then we lose some of that capability. If I speak on behalf of the experience in the Commonwealth here, for example, we know that APSC down in Canberra is having to really rebuild policy capability in the APSC. So how do we make sure that is a kind of constant within our professions? And then I guess, speaking from my experience as somebody who is mostly on the end of the policy chain in the delivery space, is how do you make sure you're always thinking about delivery from the first inception of policy? And again, I'm not implying we don't do that here, but there are great ways to work on collaboration, that you see that end-to-end policy through to delivery. You've got the voice of delivery in your first kind of conceptions of what policy changes might be required, so that as we go through from policy through to ledge or through to programme design, it's much more straightforward. So one of the roles I used to perform was giving government advice on deliverability of their policies. And sometimes that made me really unpopular with policy colleagues, because I'd say, great policy, that'll never work. So you just need somebody with that kind of delivery mentality alongside you, respecting our different viewpoints on policy development and delivery reality.
Lots more to delve into there. Kartik, we are going to turn to questions from the audience now, actually. So I will be noting in the chat the order, but first of all, we have Kartik, please come on and ask your question. Don't forget to unmute yourself.
Right, thanks, Lisa, and thanks, Ruth, very much for your overview. I think it's been very insightful. So my name is Kartik Madhura, and I'm from the the DQ or the
Yay!
climate change, energy, the environment, the water. I think I missed one of the E's, but anyways. So my question, I think, Ruth, is fundamentally great. I think it's transparency, integrity, I think are very critical to public service sector in general, and I think I applaud the work that's been undertaken. My question is, I think, climate change, energy, I think, as you would appreciate, recognize it's a complex area, and there are other agencies that are dealing with complex issues. The fundamental challenge, in my view, is actually attracting the right talent and the correct people to the public sector. And the second thing is the barriers to innovation. So I'm just keen to understand, whether does your work really address or try and cover some of those underpinning challenges there, or if not, then I'm sure it would be great if you could advocate it for it to be considered as part of any broader reviews. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Kartik, and great to hear somebody from DQ having had a hand in the creation of that department. So yeah, attraction. So I was in a workshop yesterday with a number of colleagues, again, collaboration across the sector with the Public Service Commission, thinking about our strategic workforce plan. And it's about attraction, development and retention of the right talent for the wicked problems that we're trying to solve across government. And absolutely, we need to make sure we are growing our own. So, looking at the grad program, for example, how do we bring the right capabilities through our early entry schemes, and then developing capabilities for our entire workforce, but also the ability to bring in people with expert knowledge and climate change and energy, clean energy roadmap and things like that. Absolutely, I'm sure requires those degrees of expertise as well. So I haven't got the answer, surprisingly. It's not my lead responsibility to drive that, but I am clear, as the kind of holder of the ring on public sector reform, that capability, culture, and attracting and retaining talent is definitely part of what we need to focus on to establish ourselves and maintain ourselves in the sector to do what we need to do. Again, I'm always thinking, how do we serve the government of the day? How do we serve the community of tomorrow? And how do we, as stewards of the system, keep the sector doing the right work in the right way? And attracting and retaining talent is key. I mean, speaking as somebody who's worked in both government and the private sector, government has got so many attractions. To be able to contribute to something like how do you take New South Wales on the road to clean energy? You don't get many opportunities like that in other sectors. So terms and conditions pay is one thing, but the attraction of the work and the complexity of the problems that we solve, but also the values, the integrity, the way we work are all factors for attraction.
Great. Thank you. And I'm sure there'll be a lot more work to do on that. I think having talented and committed people, whether they're professionals or working in service delivery, is really critical for the New South Wales government, as probably all governments. We have a question from Peter now we're going to move to a topic covering outcomes. So there's a few questions along these lines. So we're going to start off with Peter.
Thanks, Louisa. Hi, Ruth.
Hi,
So the new wellbeing framework sounds really exciting, wellbeing and outcomes, state outcomes. I'm curious to know, do we have a sense of how much progress, particularly quantitatively, we made toward the state outcomes last time under the OBP framework, and what can we learn about the amount of progress or lack of that we did or didn't make, and what are some of the learnings that we can take into this new approach, noting that, of course, you've made some macro changes already?
Great question. And I think my short answer, there's a long answer, but the short answer is key is obviously getting the outcomes well defined, and then B, the data systems that sit underneath that for us to be able to measure. So I think I would observe we did some great work. I mean, we were leading the world in terms of outcomes budgeting for a while, but I think I would observe we really struggled to measure the right things. So one of the things I've been keen to throw into the shaping of the future framework is, let's not just set an outcome because it's something we can measure. Let's define what the right outcome is and then find a way of measuring it, even if it's going to take us a couple of years to find the right data to do that, particularly, as you say, if we're working at the macro as well as the micro level. So that's got to be the first piece of learning, because that goes to your question about, can we measure how successful we were? I believe we can in some of those outcomes, but definitely not universally. And then I think I would observe, having come from education from a line agency, I think we missed a trick on outcomes-based budgeting, that it became a bit of a reporting burden, that we had to create all our annual reports somewhat artificially describing how our finance, resourcing and budgeting sat under particular categories, while not actually being able to describe the causality, if you like, between the funding and the outcome. So we've got to get that right. We've got to be conscious. All agencies are really, really busy. So when we're asking people to report, it's got to be on the right things.
Thank you.
I will slip in a quick comment here. I've been asked to relay a question on behalf of Susanna, and because it's really relating to budget processes and mechanisms, she asks that she's interested to hear more about budget processes, mechanisms, and existing or proposed capital planning limits. I'll just note that is a comment that we are interested to hear more about, and we might ask our Treasury colleagues to come on in the next few months to talk about that. We'd still have quite a few questions to get through. So Belinda, I think continuing on the outcomes theme, would you like to come on and ask your question?
Oh, thanks, Ruth and Louisa. I hope this is a simple one. I just wanted to ask if there is a link or something that you could share or your team could share that elaborates a bit more on the government priorities.
On the priorities or the framework? So
the priorities.
So on the priorities, I think the short answer is no on that, because the Premier has made a specific decision. He doesn't want a thing called priorities. So we're not publishing anything about the priorities to make sure that we don't slip into a kind of clearly defined set of priorities that kind of get locked in. You will see them reflected in the performance and wellbeing framework, which I am very happy to share, and which will come out. The priorities are temporary. The framework should be sustainable. So that's the kind of difference of, right now we've got a housing crisis, right? We've got to make sure every shoulder is to that wheel. I don't know how long that's going to take to solve, but eventually that will not be a priority and something else will replace it. So we're trying to create a framework that is not just for one government or just for one parliament. So it is sustainable for us in the sector to kind of be really clear on, sometimes you're not working on a priority. You know, sometimes there'll be lots of people on this call who'll look at what I've just put up on the priorities and say, hang on, I can't see my work in that, but it's still really, really important work that we do as a sector. So that's why the framework is really important for all of us to see our work and the outcomes that we're delivering for government and for the community, and a subset at this moment in time of those 5 things that I described as priorities.
Okay, thank you. That would be appreciated if you could share that. And I'm sorry, I'm Belinda. I work in DECU in biodiversity conservation and science and air policy. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Lovely to meet you. Thanks, Belinda.
Great, and that's a really interesting distinction, I guess, between capital P priorities and and priorities that we have currently, and that, recognizing that other things might come to the fore in the future. So it's really good to actually understand that. Related to that, Naomi, would you like to come on and ask your question about tracking?
Yes, thanks, Louisa. Hi, Ruth. My question is, how does this government intend to keep track of its progress on its priorities and election commitments?
Great, thanks, Naomi. So there is a team here in the Premier's department that has a responsibility for that tracking. So they are engaged with all departments and agencies who've got an election commitment, of which there are several hundred, as I'm sure you're aware, to make sure that the government does have regular reports. I think we're doing quarterly reporting on most of them, but some of the kind of bigger priority ones are obviously getting more attention more frequently. So yeah, there is a team in the Premier's department that works with each of the departments to keep track, and usual sort of, red, amber, green, is everything going okay? If it's green, all good. If it's amber, do we need attention? If it's red, then everybody jumps in to make sure that team gets the support that they need. So they do get regular reporting into Cabinet on all those commitments.
Great. I know that's a big task. I've seen the inside working tracking election commitments, particularly when they get to the road upgrade or roundabout commitments. There's a lot of detail. But yeah, I think it's it'll be really interesting to see how it works at the macro level for the priorities as well. We're going to now move into another topic, particularly I think drawing, Ruth, on your comments earlier about implementation. So Jessica, would you like to come on and ask your question?
Thanks for having me, and thanks for your presentation, Ruth and Louisa. So my question, I think you did touch on this bit before, was about the split between DPC and the into the Cabinet and the Premier's department makes sense. Just wondering what if there's any kind of mechanisms in place to ensure that the Cabinet department does put that view to, can this policy be implemented? Is this going to work? Can it be delivered, so that when it kind of moves through to that next stage, it doesn't get to there and say, oh, we can't implement this, or this doesn't make, this isn't going to work. Just wondering if there's any kind of thought being put to that.
That's a really good question, and I'm going to say yes, but I couldn't give the detail of how. But I will take it back to my TCO colleagues, because I think it's one of the questions that when they don't work in isolation. When they engage with departments on policy, one of the areas they will be looking to engage on is, have you thought through how this will land? Who's going to be the delivery partner? And in some of our big policies, that can be multiple different departments and agencies. And what are the kind of key criteria we need to look at to make sure that this policy is something that will be deliverable on the ground? So kind of like the things that I used to advise government on in the UK. So I think it's an interesting one of how much they challenge that from a TCO point of view, or whether they are assuring themselves that the departments are making that end-to-end delivery chain really visible in all their policy work. So I will take that away as a really good question to ask.
Great, thank you for that. And sorry, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Jessica Miller from State Insurance Regulatory Authority in the workers' comp policy space.
Excellent, thanks Jessica.
Great to have you on board, and just noting we have colleagues from across all agencies in our community of practice, so it's really great to hear the questions that you might have. I'm going to just ask a bit more. I know you kind of mentioned this a few times in your presentation, Ruth, about the importance of collaboration in a policy context, and I just wanted to get you to talk a little bit more about what do you think is kind of best practice collaboration when policy requires the input of different departments, and both in terms of the scope of the work or its implementation.
So again, I would observe that we all try really hard to do that collaboration. I know in a variety of policies I've seen within the sector, you've got a lead department, and they, when they're scoping out the kind of conception of a new policy, they do all that kind of mapping of, right, who do we need around the table, and try to engage colleagues. And I think the intent is there, and I think to some extent the process is there, although I think it could be a little bit more agile. For me, I feel like the barriers are we're all so busy doing our own thing that it can sometimes be a kind of burden when somebody says, hey, I've got this really important policy, I need you to contribute to it. And, you know, you might have a kind of collective sigh of, well, how can I help on that when all my energy and all my focus is on my specific policy or my particular ministerial portfolio, and when resources are tight, everyone's got to make choices. So I think it's thinking about how do we resource appropriately to recognise some of our job is always collaboration, and then secondly, how do we look at this is one of the things I would like the Treasury to come and talk to you about those budget controls, because at the end of the day, we are not incentivised to collaborate because our appropriations are really clear to appropriate portfolio ministers, and then the delegations go very much vertically. We need a way to join up in the financial part of our sector, so that we can put joint submissions together to budget, so we can get transparent collaboration through sharing of resources. So again, I don't want to break that piece of, if Cabinet decides you get X and you get Y, I don't want you swapping in between. But if we believe we can make a better outcome by giving a little bit of X to Y, or vice versa, then that should be transparent, and if appropriate, submitted to Cabinet ERC to say, in our practice of collaboration, we think we can get a bigger bang for buck by using your resources, government, in this way. And I'm sure there are colleagues on this call that had that experience in their Futures Matter. It was a really big reform in this sector that just tripped over the ability to get the finances behind the really big collaborative reform we needed to do to look after, you know, vulnerable young people. But I'm sure you'll all have examples of that. And if you've got ideas on what more we need to do to incentivise collaboration, break down those boundaries, keen to hear from you.
Great. And I couldn't have planned this better, but we have a question from our audience. I think they're going to come on and ask their question about vulnerable populations.
There we go.
Hi, good morning. Thanks, Ruth, for your presentation. My name's Nicola. I work at the Department of Education in the Connected Communities team. I'm really interested to hear what the government's thinking is at this stage around prioritising, I guess, vulnerable disadvantaged populations. Is it going to be just like an expected kind of blanket part of that policy development process, that those factors are considered in a targeted, consultative way, or are there going to be specific kind of channels or approaches that are being considered?
Great question. Thank you, Nicole. I think clearly this government has got a real equity focus on the outcomes that it wants to achieve. Now, some of those are really specific. I'm just thinking about what we've got to do collectively on NDIS as an example. That will have a specific set of outcomes around how we establish those new foundational supports. But everything we do, and I know I don't need to tell you this in education, needs to be viewed through an equity lens as well as a universal lens. So as we develop that performance and wellbeing framework, it will be a requirement for us to think about, yes, what's the universal outcome we're seeking to achieve across the population, but then how do we put the equity lens? And once we look at the data, it may mean we take different policies to different communities depending on what the data tells us in terms of the gap. And I don't just mean the closing the gap for our Aboriginal colleagues in particular, but different gaps for different equity cohorts.
Thank you. I think I'm sure there'll be a lot more discussion and development in that area as well. We're going to finish up with one final question from Claire.
Familiar face.
Hi, Ruth. It's lovely to see you again. For colleagues on the call, my name is Claire Skillman and I'm from the New South Wales Department of Education. Ruth, I was keen to hear more about if the government or the Premier's department is considering new communication strategies or plans for the public service to enhance visibility of these key directions and the work underway and support collaboration.
Another great question, and great to see you again, Claire. I don't think the government per se has a kind of communications agenda on the public service. They want us to be focused on the specific commitments and outcomes that they want to drive. But communications, as you well know, and obviously the government is very much focused on how do we use all the right communications to drive the work that we've got to do. But if you think about us as leaders of the service, so the central agencies, the Secretary's Board, my boss, Simon Draper, as the Secretary of the Premier's Department, that's a key thing that we all need to be focused on. So yes, in Premier's and Cabinet Office, we are thinking about what's the right framing of communications where we make sure, for example, everything that I've just said in the last hour, a snippet of which everybody in the sector should know and understand and actually feel real pride in. There's like thousands of people in our sector who have no idea we're doing this reforms. There's a lot to do in sharing that. There's a lot to do to keep connected to our huge workforce and make sure they do feel pride in the service, pride in our values and the outcomes that we deliver. And some of that kind of sustainability of the sector, what makes us passionate about what we do, what makes us special about why we choose to work in this sector. We will continue to think about and support Simon and the secretaries in particular in leading those communications. We don't always want to be talking about ourselves, but as employers in a large organisation, getting our internal comms right and getting the messages to the right audience is key and is something we're still thinking about. So again, if anyone's got any thoughts on how we amplify some of these key messages, then keen to hear from you.
Thank you. And clearly this is just the start, and I'm really excited on the behalf of policy people across the sector to be able to assist in the delivery of all of the critical things you've mentioned today, including outcomes and collaboration, communication, making sure vulnerable people are considered, and we think about that in service delivery. I wanted to thank you, Ruth, on behalf of the Community of Practice for sharing your thoughts today and your time as well so generously. For our members, our next webinar will be in March on the 24-hour economy. And I wanted to thank you all again for joining with us again in our webinar series. So I look forward to seeing you throughout the year as well. And thank you for your interest and enthusiasm in policy. So for now, I'll have to say thank you very much. Thanks, Ruth. Bye.
Bye.